It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the Center for Digital Strategies Fireside Chat. I'm Professor Alva Taylor. I'm the faculty director of the Center for Digital Strategies, joined by Patrick Wheeler, who's the executive director of the center. Doing Q&A, we'll also be joined by Leah Parker Belfer, who's the D&I chair for the Tuck student body and is a T22, and also by Assistant Dean Dia Draper, who will also be joining us doing Q&A. I'd like to acknowledge our partners for this talk. The Center, of course, the Center of Digital Strategies, the Black Students Association at Tuck, the Dean's Office for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and Dartmouth Women in Science Project. So it's with great pleasure to have all of these partners involved, and it just shows you the interest that we have in this particular topic and particular guests, which is we are with great pleasure and excitement to have Shalini Kantayya, who's the award-winning filmmaker and activist, and the director and producer of the film Coded Bias that we all watched. It premiered in 2020 Sundance. It's been highly acclaimed, won many critics awards. I think it has one of the highest Rotten Tomatoes, 100% of any film on the site. Her film previous to this was called Catching the Sun, which also won a New York Times critics. It was a New York Times critic pick. It was released on Netflix. It also was nominated for the Environmental Media Association Award for Best Documentary. She also directed an episode of National Geographic series Breakthrough, which is executive produced by Ron Howard. She's a TED Fellow. She's a Fulbright Scholar. She's associate of the UC Berkeley Grad School of Journalism. But the thing that I think warms my heart the most is that she's a science fiction fan. So with great pleasure, Shalini, we welcome you and thank you very much for making the time to be here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor, and thank you for that incredibly generous introduction. I really appreciate it.
It's in having you here. One of the wonderful things about having you here is that we watch this amazing film, and now we get to see a little bit of what happened behind the scenes and how and sort of how the bread was baked in seeing this. Your previous film was Catching the Sun, which was about the focus on the economic opportunity of solar energy. And then you went to Coded Bias. How did you come to want to tell this particular story? And what's the connecting themes or theme between the two films?
Well, I'm sort of a self-proclaimed as a sci-fi fanatic. And so I love technology. I love thinking about the future of technology. And I think my work as a filmmaker has always explored disruptive technology, and whether it sort of makes the world more fair or less fair, gives more opportunity or less opportunity, and to whom. And so I think with Catching the Sun, it was sort of a utopian vision of how small scale residential solar could uplift working people and solve climate change at the same time. And with Coded Bias, I sort of fell down the rabbit hole of the dark side of big tech. I think 3 years ago, I didn't know what an algorithm was. I think everything that I had known about artificial intelligence came from Steven Spielberg's imagination or Stanley Kubrick's imagination. But I sort of stumbled down the rabbit hole when I read a book called Weapons of Math Destruction by Cathy O'Neil, and subsequently Algorithms of Oppression by Sophia Moja-Noble, and Artificial Unintelligence by Meredith Broussard, and saw a TED Talk by Joybalawani. And I think the thing that I came to terms with in the making of Coded Bias is that I didn't realize how we as humans are already outsourcing our decision making to machines, and the way in which algorithms, AI is already becoming this gatekeeper of opportunity, deciding things like who gets hired, who gets healthcare, who gets the vaccine. And I think through Joy's work, I learned that the same systems that we're trusting to govern human destiny have not been vetted for racial bias or for gender bias, or for that they'll not have unintended consequences. And that's sort of how I began to see that this could actually roll back civil rights advances. And that sort of set me on the journey to tell this story that was very complicated, but I think worth telling.
As we think about that, I mean, it's interesting that you put it that way, because some people would argue that, we have all these biases in human decision making. And so even though there might be biases in algorithmic, maybe it's better than human decision making.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And when you hear that argument, or you hear that statement, what's your reaction to that?
I think that the sort of brilliant cast of my film has taught me that like AI is a reflection of human beings. So they reflect our human biases. I think that in the making of this film, I have developed more compassion towards human beings, because bias is an innate human condition. It's not just like in some bad people. So because bias is an innate human condition that's in all of us, regardless of who we are, it's something that you have to control for perpetually. And I think that what I've learned is that these technologies are actually a reflection of us. They're not better than us. They're just a reflection of us. And they're using data from the past. And that past, as we know, is like full of historic inequalities and systematic inequalities. So I always think that like we think technologies like are gods, but I think they're more like our children. They're like reflections of ourselves, and they reflect our flaws, and like all of those things.
Now you've had an amazing response to your film. Has there been any response that surprised you, or any impact that surprised you?
I'm so surprised that technology companies have screened this film. Like big tech companies have screened this film and invited me in, and that's an incredible conversation to have. And I think what's amazing to me about Coded Bias is that I sort of had felt that when it comes to AI, all the knowledge has been in the hands of the few. So all of the power has been in the hands of the few. And I feel that we all interact with these technologies, and we all need some basic literacy about how algorithms work and how big data works. And from the time we start to use these technologies, which is now like 10 years old. And what I hope Coded Bias would do would be a kind of leveling of the playing field, so that we could all sit at the table and feel like we could have a conversation together, and provide some basic ways of talking about this. And I think that what I'm surprised by is that not only does my favorite comments have been like, my grandma loved your film, or and also that technology companies have somehow used it to have a conversation. That's been also surprising, that it's not just for people, that it's a lowest common denominator, but the technology companies are also reflecting on this themselves. And I think that's really powerful. And I think that I've learned that there are a lot of well-meaning, super brilliant people working at these companies that are well-meaning. And I think we just all need some, I always think that legislation gives good policy, gives them inspiration, even more inspiration to do the right thing, that it shouldn't all be up to big tech.
right? It's not just grandmothers. I actually mentioned this to my son who's in high school. And I said, oh, it's long because he has, typical teenage attention span. I say it's long, you might want to watch it, over the weekend or whatever. And, an hour and a half after I sent him the text, he actually said, I watched the whole thing and it was great. So it's not just grandmothers that you're connecting with, but it also connects with, if you can connect with with a 16-year-old, then you're doing a pretty good job there. So that's great. We're sort of in the COVID times. And as I was watching the film, I was just thinking about how this would have been different either during COVID or if you were making it a year from now. As you think about that, how do you think the film and the message would have been or might be different, because of COVID or after COVID?
Well, I think two things together. It was so interesting because the film premiered at Sundance in 2020, which might have been a super spreader event, but I'm so grateful. It was like the last festival that was pre-pandemic, and I got to see the premiere of the film with an audience, which informed the recutting of the film after Sundance. But I remember, South by Southwest, we had gotten in and then the world changed. And I remember thinking that people would not have appetite for this kind of film because it requires a certain kind of engagement, and I was so surprised. I think that the pandemic, in combination with the largest movement for civil rights and equality with the protests against the unjust murder of George Floyd, really changed how the film was received. Because I also think that then I felt like for the first time, the public had this inspiration and to learn to talk about systematic racism. And I thought that really opened the conversation. And that's when you saw those tech companies change their policy. IBM said that they would get out of the facial recognition game. They've changed their business model. I mean, I never thought that would happen. Microsoft said they would stop selling it to law enforcement, and Amazon said they would press pause. And that happened in June of 2020. So I think that also had an impact in how the film was received. And then being able to roll it out through virtual cinemas at home during the pandemic, and have conversations like this one is sort of how the film has found its audience in this new world.
You've talked to, you mentioned the impact you've had in companies, and you've talked to lots of companies and executives, and you've been very nice in telling us the positive things.
Mm-hmm.
What's been the biggest challenge, or what's the part of your film that when you talk to companies and executives in companies that they get wrong or they don't quite get? Is there anything on that side?
It's, for me, the things I think technology companies miss or have willful blindness around is that it's not always a technological solution. That's not always the best solution. And for me, it really is about rethinking this race to efficiency. And also, it strikes me as an industry as the car industry. Like when we first had the car, we had no regulations around cars. It wasn't that long ago that it wasn't the law to wear a seatbelt. You didn't have to wear a seatbelt. It was an optional thing. Or you didn't maybe have to put a baby in a seat, a special seat. Like these safety precautions happened, the FDA happened, and now I'm so grateful I can read a label and see what's in a pharmaceutical product. but there is no label for a data set that might be racially biased. There is no label for a product that might be harmful under these uses. We still don't have any laws or protections. Like here during COVID, this is the only way we can be together, but I don't know how many of you read the terms of conditions. I didn't. And so, you know, what are we giving up? There should be some basic protections. And so I think the way I would frame things differently is around two things. Right now, big tech, well, one, I feel like most of the meaningful laws we have around big tech are created before the advent of the internet. And so we can do some strengthening and some like, it is a Wild West. These things are moving too quickly. They're going straight from, like, take for instance, what was so startling about what Joy discovered, the technology that Joy discovered was, you know, she's just trying to make an art project work. But this was not a technology that's on a shelf being beta tested at MIT. This was like being sold to the FBI and to ICE, our immigration officials, and sold to law enforcement. And no one we elected, there's no government oversight. That just happens. And to me, we haven't really looked at the fact that we as democracies are picking up the tools of authoritarian states with no legal protections on how this data is used. I mean, these companies like Google and Facebook have the kind of data about us that make the Stasi look like they had a light touch, you know, like, and I think like people have always talked about it around privacy, and to me, I disconnect from that. It feels like it's, I don't connect with that word. And I think the more accurate word is invasive surveillance. And the fact that using this data, you know, companies or the companies that they sell this data to can create these complex psychological predictions of who you are based on your data from different sources. And anyway, it's my feeling that there should be some laws is the thing, and some process. And right now it goes to market and then we have to roll it back and say it's not safe. And I would rather there were some agency saying it's safe before it's commercially available, especially to law enforcement.
It's a really interesting time. If you look over the last even just few months, the last 2 months, there have been a number of kind of high profile actions taken, whether it's the settlement in Facebook's lawsuit in violation of the law in Illinois that bans facial recognition, in Canada, you know, ruling that Clearview's kind of facial collection is illegal, and it's not allowed to operate. Do you see, you know, now a year plus, you know, almost 2 years on since the start of this project, do you see that momentum sort of building, or do you think these are temporary, you know, you know, in this moment in time, we're seeing a little bit of a, you know, regression, but it's over time, the trend is still in one direction?
In honesty, I've seen both. I mean, I think the firing of Dr. Tanit Gebru at Google is disheartening and certainly sends a chilling effect. I've seen a pattern where often big companies attempt to dismiss independent science that sheds a light on bias in AI before they take action. I think it's important to note that these companies took action in June 2020. The research had been out for 2 years, so that the social movement had something, I believe, strongly to do with the timing of that. And so I really believe it's up to us. What I've seen is, I think we have a moonshot moment to call for greater ethics in technology. And it's up to all of us to first educate ourselves. I mean, you have, when Zuckerberg goes to Congress and you have sitting senators who are like, how does Facebook make money? And Mark Zuckerberg has to say, Senator, we sell ads, because there's no literacy in this new huge industry that can't be acceptable. Like, there's got to be some basic literacy so that we can push policymakers to protect our rights.
And the literacy question is really interesting. So you are not at your core a technologist, and diving into the deep AI is not exactly beginner stuff when it comes to learning about technology. What was your process for becoming somewhat, knowledgeable about the space, learning enough to be able to tell this story effectively? And what did you learn about that process that maybe others could benefit from along the way as well?
Well, I think anyone who attempts to challenge the power of AI, including people in my film like Trinae Moran, the Brooklyn residents who fought back against facial recognition being installed, or Daniel Santos, the teacher who fought against the automated evaluation, saying he was a bad teacher. We all had this sense of like worrying about feeling stupid, because there's such a rhetoric, and we've been taught that there's like this sort of big magic. I think all of us had some sort of imposter syndrome. I know I couldn't talk to people at parties for 2 years because I was so worried they would ask me what I was making a film about. And at the time, the working title was Racist Robots. And so I said, well, I'm kind of making a movie about racist robots. Literally, I would see people's eyes glaze over and I'd be all alone, because it was so hard to describe to people outside of the field. And even when we did our first test screenings, there were so many screenings where we're like, did we get that? And then like so long before we're like, did you enjoy seeing it? Like it was such a process to try to explain complex science in small bites, like to try to get, and to do it with integrity, but try to translate it and then connect it to people who had some emotional stakes, who could be impacted. I think that was my goal as a storyteller, because oftentimes those things aren't connected. And I was so grateful. Someone was commenting before we started about the emotional journey of the film, and that made me so grateful, because as a filmmaker, that's really my job, like, is not just to tell people a story, but also to hopefully inspire empathy. And in that process, I mean, Roger Ebert called film empathy machines. And so, and that comes from the many people who I'm so grateful shared their stories and for whom inspired me.
You talk about empathy. The heart of the film is Joybalawani. Why did you choose her as the center of this story? What made her the vessel to take us on this journey?
Well, I think that Joy has a very rare ability of both having incredible integrity in her scientific research, where she could call out these big companies and felt brave enough to put her academic reputation on the line to do that. So she had this background as a scientist, and yet is also an artist and a communicator, and connected to communities like the Brooklyn residents, who are marginalized, and therefore had this unique perspective of being able to sort of move between these different communities that I think is rare. And then also, it's just crazy that facial recognition doesn't see dark faces, and that she kind of stumbles upon that by accident, and that lends itself to a very visual story, even though much of the film is very abstract.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting because you you take something that often, if it was found in a tech company, would be a trivial sort of product defect or lack of performance, and just kind of quickly written off. And then it just kind of grows throughout the film in a way to see all of the different ways. And you go from New York to Cambridge to South Africa to London to Hong Kong. Why was it important? Did you always plan to have all those different locales, all those different settings?
The research process has always been very rigorous for me. I could sort of lose myself in a rigorous research process. And I pre-pandemic, I considered myself a very global citizen. I guess we're all on the internet, so we're all sort of World Wide Web citizens now, but which makes this work even more important. But I think that I tend to tell stories in a global way. If you look at all my work, oftentimes they take place in different parts of the world because I'm so aware of different ways that people look at things. And I think the juxtaposition always makes us see ourselves a little clearer. And in the case of data protection, it was just really important for me to show these three approaches. The approach of China, which is sort of like the Black Mirror episode vignette inside of the documentary, in which an authoritarian regime has unfettered access to your data, and yet is a reality that's really close, because there's part of us that's like, wow, cool, I could just pay for a candy bar with my face. It's how convenient, like there's part of us that has that I think is a reflection of ourselves. And I think Europe, which has some framework with the GDPR of like data rights in a human rights framework, and then the US, which is basically a wild, wild west where big tech can do really whatever.
Yeah, I mean, it was somewhat shocking, the part where, and I think the woman talks about choosing and trusting her friends based on their social score. And I think there is a Black Mirror episode all about that, about rating people on their social score. And that was shocking in many ways. And as you think about these types of things, and so, our audience are students and business students and some of our executives, having gone through this and made this film, what lessons or what would you want them to take from the film to bring to their companies and their decision making?
Well, I think until we have some laws in place, I feel like get educated around basic literacy in the fields of algorithms and AI. It impacts us every day in how we see the world, and we should understand a little bit of the back end of how these things work, and engage with them. I think if you're working at a technology company, what I've learned is that inclusion is not just something that's good for the pictures, but when bias is an innate human condition, it's actually integral, and should be that our businesses reflect the world that we live in. Our world is 51% women, and so 14% AI researchers is abysmal. And that may mean that we need new ways of integrating, bringing new people into the fold. I think that the field of AI would be greatly benefited from outside ethics researchers, ethics curriculum. So I think that those are things I would all keep in mind. And I think that, oftentimes technology companies sort of frame this around efficiency. And I think that in the making this film, I sort of question sometimes this race, like as human beings, what's the goal? Is the goal to go as fast as possible? Is that actually the goal? And that, we have anyway, we haven't even talked about the income inequality that these big tech companies are creating with Jeff Bezos on track to be the world's first trillionaire, which, tech companies have been gaining income in this time of pandemic. And so it is my hope that everybody participates in the dialogue of bringing more of our humanity to these technologies.
Okay. Now we're about to transition to Q&A, but I had one sort of filmmaking question. Is there a scene that you had to cut or you didn't include that in looking back you wish you would have had time, or that you didn't get access to film? Is there anything that you wish you could have included in the film that you didn't get the opportunity to?
There's so many scenes, but the one that was just short of getting in is a clip of Meredith Broussard. And it's so witty, but I kept trying to whittle down the film shorter and shorter. And she so brilliantly talks about how so much of what we see on the internet is what's popular, but what's popular isn't good. And I think that she really succinctly puts that into perspective. But maybe I'll use it in the next film.
So great. I want to sort of roll over to you, Leah, to help us with the Q&A. And so we're opening it up. So we're gonna have questions from the audience, and Leah, the baton is yours now.
Thank you so much. I will gladly take it and hopefully share it with the audience as well. And so thank you so much for being here with us tonight. I really enjoyed the film. I think it left me, it was interesting when I was reflecting on it. I initially said, that I really enjoyed watching it, and I did, but I also think that probably oversimplifies how it left me feeling very worried and reflective on what to do next. And so I think I'll actually start with a question from the group, because I think it's most related to where the conversation's been going. And then I actually have a question as well. But to start, Dawn Carey, the director of WISP, which is Women in Science Project, and Samantha Palermo have similar questions around kind of what I think, and this was somewhat how I felt too at the end of watching it, of what to do next. And I think it was very eye-opening. And I know you've spoken a little bit about educating oneself and, advocating to policymakers to take care of our rights. But I was curious if you had any intention for there to be a takeaway for viewers of, what do you do on your level and your scale in your community?
Good question. I feel like the best way that we can answer that question is if you go to the codedbias.com website, there's a take action page, and it has a lot of follow-up materials. It has a toolkit, an activist toolkit. It has a list of great organizations. I think the tricky thing about this issue is it's one that requires systematic change. But there's lots of amazing organizations like the ACLU and the Algorithmic Justice League and Electronic Frontier Foundation and Fight for the Future, who works a lot with students to ban facial recognition on college campuses. And these organizations supporting them by signing a petition or volunteering or giving what you can is a great way to actually take a next step. And a lot of times these are just young people just like you who are just so incredibly effective at making strategic change, like Silky Carlo at Big Brother Watch UK. I've seen like 3 or 4 people just hold back the the London police using real-time facial recognition. And I also think that one thing that a lot of these organizations are doing is targeting local change, and that could be your university, or it could be your building, your university, your town. I'm seeing technological hubs like San Francisco, Cambridge, Somerville, places where they know how these technologies work have been the first to ban them locally. And I think once you do that, we had a referendum on the table in California for data protection that ultimately didn't pass this last election. But I think if we were to get, I think Illinois has slightly better data protections than the rest of the states. But I think the more we can sort of disrupt the stronghold that big tech has, sort of ubiquitously, I think the more that we have change, a chance to sort of leverage that to make bigger change. And you even see that with the GDPR, where when Cambridge Analytica happened, American citizens were able to have some legal recourse because our data transited Europe. And so, and tech companies don't want to create, policy for 49 states and one. So I think that local change and supporting organizations are a good way to make a real difference.
Awesome. And going back to one of my questions I had when I was watching the film, I noticed right off the bat, most of the individuals you interviewed were issuing, warnings and caution around AI and facial recognition. And I do think the one contrast was your interview in China with the woman who was saying, she really enjoyed how China was using facial recognition and was arguing the benefits. And I wanted to ask you, about your decision to put that in the documentary, and any reflections you might have had based on, her perspective and what she shared.
Well, to be honest, like, we found out what she was saying when we're editing later.
Okay.
So, we were very shocked too. It was not, this was actually what she said. But at the same time, it's not surprising because China doesn't have free speech, and someone who was critical of the system, which I'm sure there are, would have been challenging. It would have been dangerous for them to speak freely and critically. And I definitely did not want that to put anyone in danger. And so it was not surprising. And at the same time, I wanted to include it because I was as surprised by it as dazzled by this that's what documentary was. I was like, wow. I mean, even the translator, the three of us were sitting in the room, the editor, the translator, and I were like, wait, what? And so that was really great to, and so we put it in. And I think that her experience is closer to ours. I think there's part of us always who's like, that was really cool. I could buy a candy bar with my face, if I'm tall enough. And so, I thought that was important to include.
As someone who's 5'2", I completely empathize with if I'm tall enough. But yeah, that's interesting to hear how it ended up getting put in, because to me, I actually thought it made a lot of sense because, to your point about being rigorous in your research and the conversation, I feel like there are advocates. And so it made sense to have that perspective included. And it kind of felt like a complimentary of like, this is why AI is happening. Like, it wouldn't be happening if it wasn't making someone's life easier theoretically, and this is the business case, but your documentary is also really showing that the repercussions of getting that convenience potentially. I guess another question I had, I am an associate in the Center for Digital Strategies at Tuck, and we were just having a conversation in small groups about bias and AI. And my small group breakout room was talking about, are we ready? Do we need to press pause potentially on, implementing AI and algorithms and in certain industries or altogether? And, we weren't really sure, we saw the pros, cons, but would love your perspective after, making the film. Like, do you have a perspective on that?
I do. I think we should press pause on many technologies. I think that there should be a way in which these technologies come to scale, and that we should have some safety provisions in line. And I don't know. I couldn't vet these technologies, but I want someone like Kathy O'Neill in the room who can. And I think that the burden of proof that they should be safe should happen before you put something out and not after. Because of how powerful these technologies are, because they can be deployed at scale, because they can be misused, because they can be used by predatory third-party nefarious actors, even in spite of the best interests of the companies. I mean, so many things can happen at every level, that there's got to be some safety provisions for people, especially when it involves such personal data that can be traced back to us.
Mm-hmm.
Let me just go. Can I do a follow-up, Leah?
Yeah, please.
I feel like I'm representing big tech, and that's not the intention at all. But in much like you, and talking to a lot of executives, I've heard certain things that resonate. And one response they would have to that would be, "Oh, it's gonna disadvantage us. It's gonna slow us down. We're gonna get passed by China and Europe and all the other places, and we're going to be shackled, and it's going to destroy our economy." What would be your response to that?
I have the same, it's the same argument that climate change, that they have around climate change. It's going to kill the economy. It's going to kill American business. And I'm an independent filmmaker, so I believe that the limitations unleash new creativity and new imagination. And that the limitations are what install. And what we have with AI is a stunning lack of imagination, because an elite group of people have been designing it, because we think it can only function on this one economic model of invasive, like this surveillance capitalism model, and where they get limitless access to our data with no financial benefit to us, but to them, with these massive monopolies on our data, and us having no recourse, or Facebook that's increasingly becoming an enemy of true information. I mean, in terms of what's happened in Australia with them kicking all the news platforms off their site, not making a strong, not subjecting political ads to its true fact checking. I mean, there's so many ways in which we just need regulations in these major ways. And I think what we're also witnessing is that our democracies are fragile, and that we actually need this to happen quickly. And I think misinformation is one of those examples.
That's actually, this relates, your question, Professor Taylor, relates really well to Sammy Haas in the Q&A, and I apologize if I mispronounced your name. But they ask, how do we regulate technology without discouraging engineers from innovation? And I think you started to build on it, but is there anything, or started to speak to it, but is there anything else?
Yeah, I mean, and that's exactly what I think. I think that it's been so dominated by one business model and one way of thinking, we actually don't even know what AI could look like for the common good. And, because I believe in an FDA doesn't mean I don't like food, right? You believe that you love food, and you want there to be a certain standard of safety and health for everyone. And so you start with that as as the basis. This is the framework. We want our democratic ideals. You'll not operate like this secret, behind, without government oversight. Let's just start there. We won't operate without government oversight. And I think that unleashes imagination and creativity. And also what unleashes creativity is inclusion. And we have had a radical exclusion in this industry. And I think the more that we can pull voices into the room, not just like that are diverse racially and gender and socioeconomic and religious backgrounds, but also maybe all didn't go to elite universities, maybe some that went to city colleges and had, different circumstances, because that is how we get to be more innovative and more creative. And I think this way of saying is the only way we can do it is with absolutely no rules in place. It's just it just goes against the myth of Silicon Valley, which is where the geniuses that can solve everything. So.
And going back to, when we talked about pressing pause and then thinking about, proactively, addressing bias before rolling out and scaling AI. I think Joanna asked in the Q&A, do you think that the first step is eliminating bias in human life before building AI and rolling it out? And is that kind of the necessary steps? And I think right now it's probably not how it's happening.
Well, that's the thing, is like, we can never be without bias. It really just is an innate human condition. What we do is sort of perpetuate, like Joy really puts it well when she says it's like hygiene. You can't just do it one day and think you're done. You have to perpetually be vigilant about it. And I think what we can do is build diverse teams that help us see into each other's biases, try to control for it. Make sure that there are people in the room that don't think like us, and are asking different questions than we're used to asking, especially when you're talking about engineers who are used to thinking very specifically.
And when you were making the film, were there any biases that you noticed through the process of making the film that in tech and in AI that you hadn't thought of or hadn't been actively thinking about prior?
Well, I was just amazed that it could happen without the engineers knowing. And sometimes when the engineers were trying to do the exact opposite, like in the case of the Amazon hiring AI, and they thought, oh, this will undo bias. And lo and behold, it was looking at who got hired in the past and who got retained and who got promoted. And lo and behold, the AI starts discriminating against anyone it could tell it was a woman. And I thought that was just incredibly shocking to me, because that bias showed itself in the technology, even in spite of the best intentions of the programmers.
And now to ask a question and try to shift to give technology a little bit of love here. Marina asks, how can we use current technologies, for self-defense or in a positive way to heal communities, especially those that have been historically marginalized by technology? So is there a place for AI to be a source of good? And do you have thoughts on that?
I think AI, I just want to say I love tech. Everyone in my film loves tech. We're huge tech heads. That's why we want it to work in a way that doesn't kill our civil rights. And so I think that that's just important to know. And I don't say anything nice really because I feel like there's just an ethos that's always there. Of course, there are great uses of technology. But I think fundamentally, the thing I'd like to change is sort of the business model of this limitless access to our data and how our data is bought and sold, and just have some protections as by way of being people of a democracy, just have some balance to that power of big tech.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I guess I have a question too, as we're coming near time, I was curious if you have plans moving forward for either how to build off of coded bias or what projects you're working on next, and if they're related to coded bias.
Well, what happens to you when you make a film is everyone then comes to you for a film like the film you just made.
Right. Yeah.
So I feel like there's been a lot of stuff in the tech space, which I'm always interested to talk about. But let's just say I'm much more intellectually, like I'm very diverse in what I like to think about, though I love science topics. I don't know why. I just love there's so much in science to be dazzled by. So I love science and technology, and it definitely is a source of inspiration.
Just on a personal level, are you, in coming out of this or where you are now, are you more optimistic or pessimistic about the future?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think conversations like this one make me optimistic. And the fact that, people inside of these technology companies are also having these conversations. And they're aware of this as an issue. And there are smart people who are trying to solve this issue, but we shouldn't leave them alone on this issue. And it shouldn't just be up to them. And I think the more that we engage, we the people sort of engage in the conversation together, that gives me a lot of hope. But the truth is, I really think this is a script we're all writing together. And it really is about what we all decide to do next and the choices we make. And what this film has inspired in me is an idea about bringing more of our humanness to what we do and what we create, whether it's our technologies or the businesses we build.
And when you look back, so you've made this wonderfully acclaimed film, and 20 years from now, what do you hope the film stands for? What do you hope when you're telling your kid or the kid from down the block, or someone who doesn't know you made the film and they see that film? What do you want the film to stand for?
Well, I love when the film has been shown at all these human rights festivals, and I really love that framework because human rights is really about the inherent value of every human being. And it's my hope that Coded Bias is engaged in challenging technology to honor the inherent value of every human being, and that it's not just about creating the perfect algorithm, that sometimes it's about prioritizing a more humane society, and sometimes that means you have to disrupt efficiencies so that you can be more humane. So that is, it's my hope that Coded Bias makes a contribution to human rights culture.
It's interesting because I was thinking about that, and I was thinking I would love for this film to be like a film from the medieval ages, where it was a film on leeching as a medical operation, and we look at the film, we go, "Can you believe they used to do that?" But that was the film that made us realize how stupid it was. And I hope this film has a little bit of that it when we look back on it 20 years ago, we realize how stupid we were, or uninformed, I shouldn't say stupid, uninformed we were in this. And as you think about, so you've had, there were lots of brilliant people who were associated with the film. And interestingly enough, the people at the forefront of this movement were primarily women, and there were other people there, but they were primarily women. Do you think that's a coincidence, or do you think there was something to that?
Well, I will tell you that the question is often asked, and I did not set out to make a woman's film. It just sort of, there was a moment I look back and I literally was watching the film. I'm like, huh, it's all women. And it was as much a revelation to me as it was in the film, but it was actually the research that kept bringing me back to the same voices of women, people of color, LGBTQ, religious minorities, misfits of all sorts. And that was because I think the incredible cast of the film had not only advanced degrees in this subject matter, but also had an experience of being an outsider, not having their experience centered, being on the margins, and help shine a light on this. And yes.
So this is wonderful. We are indebted to you to spend this time with us. We are indebted to you to have made this film. We look forward to all the wonderful films that you make in the future. I hope you, when all of this is settled down, I hope you take some time and come up to the Upper Valley and to Dartmouth and Tuck to spend some time with us. We would love to have you. And just thank you for a wonderful, eye-opening talk, film, discussion, interaction. Thank you very much.
Yes,
Thanks so much. It was an honor. Thanks so much.
And thanks to all our partners, the CDS, the Black Students Association at Tuck, the Dean's Office for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, the Dartmouth Women in Science Project, all of the people who took the time out to listen and to participate. Thank all of you. Have a wonderful night.